I think we'll start, if that's okay, so we don't run too much. So thanks everyone for coming to this roundtable discussion, which is the last event in the Female Gay Youth Programme. I'm Ollie from the High Park Pitch House, and we've been running this in collaboration with Village Bookstore and Gallery upstairs. And it's been a series of events which have been exploring sort of female photographers. Been a couple of screenings at the Pitch House, one on Jane Bown and Vivian Meyer, which some of you may have come to, and there's an exhibition that's finishing on today actually at Village, and this is all finishing with this event today. The reason we wanted to put this on was because we had the screenings in the exhibition, but through that lots of interesting topics and debates were kind of forming, and we thought it's a really good chance to be discussing those. So yeah, that's why I've invited 4 speakers along today, so thank you all for coming. We have Zoe Sawyer from the Tetley, who's the creator of the Tetley, and she also has her own curatorial practice through projects such as Mexico, Project Space, which was formed a few years ago, and the Art Market. There's Jill, who's from Pavilion, director of Pavilion, and you've been there for quite a number of years, yeah? Since when, sir? 60s.
6 years.
6 years. How does that work? Okay, cool.
I find reverse.
And there's Helen, who is a lecturer at Leeds College of Art, lecturing, well, her research includes female street photographers and sort of gaze theories, and specifically you've been looking into the work produced by Vivian Meyer, which is just a really happy coincidence for us. And then finally is Pippa Oldfield, who's head of programme at Impressions. Pippa's also been a start, I think you're at the early stages, right, of exhibition, creating an exhibition at Impressions about female war photography.
Kind of, yes.
Kind of, yes. I've probably got that all wrong. So yeah, the event will be kind of broken into 2 sections really. So each one of our speakers will talk about sort of a chosen topic that's related to female photographers. They're all kind of quite diverse and covering lots of different elements. And then the second half will be more discursive, so that's when we'll invite you to ask questions and to, yeah, hopefully it'll be fairly informal and people will be able to kind of discuss maybe some of the elements that have been spoken about in the first half, but maybe you have questions about certain topics that haven't yet been discussed that you think it would be good to do. So yeah, I'll let you get on, and I think first, are you going to start?
I'm going to,
yeah,
well, thank you, Ollie, very much for organising this event. So to introduce my work, I'm Pippa. I'm a photography curator, head of programme at Impressions Gallery in Bradford. Can you actually hear me at the back? Yeah. And I'm a doctoral fellow at Durham University as well. I'm going to talk a bit about the issue of war photography by women, which I think is going to connect to some of these larger issues we're discussing about underrepresentation or exhibiting women photographers. But firstly, for those of you that don't know, Impressions Gallery, we're based in Bradford. We're a public-funded, not-for-profit gallery of photography. It's always had strong female leadership from the very beginning. It was co-founded by Val Williams in 1972. It's currently run by Anne McNeil since 2000. And we've always shown a really diverse range of female photographers as part of our programme. So people like Frances Benjamin Johnston, Dorothea Langer, Susan Meiselas, Jo Spence, Joy Gregory, Trish Morrissey, Anna Fox, Helen Zia. Many important women photographers have shown at Impressions. And both Anne and I believe it's really important that we do adequately represent female photographers as part of our programme. I was actually looking back before I came to this talk, doing a bit of research into some statistics, and over the last 10 years I looked at the shows that we've done. We've actually shown 45% of our programme produced by women photographers, which isn't quite 50-50, but it's actually really high in terms of arts venues. I know that the Photographers Gallery is about 30%, so we're actually quite high in that respect. We're not tokenistic. We wouldn't show work purely because it's made by a woman photographer. It's always about photography first. But we've got so much strong photography to choose from, we do take into account other issues, and gender is one of those. We also think about race, about sexuality, about cultural and geographical background, so we're considering a number of factors and viewpoints when we're putting together the programme. As Ollie mentioned, I'm just starting to develop a show called No Man's Land, which is for Impressions in 2016. And that's going to reflect on some of the ways in which women have connected with war and photography in the UK from the First World War to the present day. So why do a women-only show and why war? Well, I think war is a very interesting topic to explore the relationship between photography and gender. When we think about war, I think assumptions about gender roles and about appropriate kinds of behaviour or types of photography, they become really pronounced. And war is often assumed to be a masculine activity or domain in which women might be seen as peripheral. And the same can be said of conventional war photography. When we think of classic war photos, we tend to think of risk-taking photojournalists at the front line or in the combat zone, people like Robert Capa and Don Cullen. So when I tell people I'm working on the subject of women and war and photography, the first response I usually get is, have there been any? And yes, there have been a number of women war photographers, but clearly there have been exceptions. There have been fewer than men. And there are many reasons for that. It's partly because of the way in which war photography is defined precisely as this genre of images made by photojournalists in the combat zone. And historically, there have been many barriers to women working in that way. So I've been quite interested in thinking through a bit more about some of these barriers. So for instance, women in the First and Second World Wars were explicitly forbidden from actually entering the combat zone to take photographs compared to their male counterparts. So Olive Edis, I don't know if any of you have heard of Olive Edis, but she's someone I'm planning to include in the show. She was commissioned by the Women's Work Subcommittee in the First World War to photograph women's work in France and Belgium, and it took an awful lot of persuasion for her to get permission to actually go there. In fact, I think she even had to sign a contract with the army saying she wouldn't take photographs, which she promptly ignored, I'm glad to say. But she wasn't able to go there until 1919, after the war had ended, so she photographed the aftermath of the First World War, and they're really fascinating photos. Lee Miller and Margaret Burke-White, who are two of the most famous female war photographers, were both accredited US correspondents in the Second World War. Again, they were forbidden from actually going to the combat zone, and they defied regulations, really. They just kind of went ahead and took their pictures. So there are these barriers that that women have to cross. Historically, certain forms of photography have been considered suitable for women at certain times. So portraiture, for example, has always been considered a respectable profession for women photographers, but photojournalism is much more contested. So for instance, after World War II, despite there being a number of women war correspondents, gender roles kind of contracted after men came back from the front line. For example, Life magazine, which some of you may know as the biggest circulation photographic illustrated magazine in the US, treated its female staff photographers differently from men. So women were much more likely to be given assignments on domestic affairs or stories about children or animals, rather than foreign or news assignments, which went to men. Women's photographic careers have often been shorter than men's, so they've sometimes been interrupted by marriage or children. And responsibilities of family and childcare have sometimes discouraged women from photographing in the combat zone. And then a number of women photojournalists or artists that I've talked to have spoken to me about that, how saying after having children they don't want to put themselves at bodily risk anymore. Jill Cole, who's someone that I'm talking to about this show, she's a mother, and she said, she's got this rather, more limited kind of radius in which she's able to make work. So she's taking pictures about a military training ground in the northeast of England, near where she lives. So she's able to comment upon the experience of war and militarism without actually travelling to a combat zone. But whilst many women do make work like this that comments on the experience of conflict, if their work's not made in the war zone, it's often not seen as proper or authentic war photography. Another reason is the writing of photographic histories. Despite women's activity, they're quite often overlooked in favour of male counterparts. And this quite often happens when you get men and women collaborating together, perhaps as a husband and wife team. And I've been looking at the history of a woman called Harriet Tytler, who was in India in the 1850s and photographed the Indian Mutiny in 1857, quite graphic images of war and its aftermath. But because she photographed with her husband Robert, she's generally not credited as a co-author of the work. This is despite the fact that she actually was much more technically accomplished than him and actually taught him photographic skills. There's a historical tendency for women to keep their photographic work private and consider it low status as a hobby or a craft. And men are much more likely to contribute to public archives or to give their work a higher status as art, and this obviously affects the collecting of photography as well. Women are more likely to be self-deprecating or to undervalue their work. For instance, the work of Lee Miller, who's now considered a really important war photographer, abandoned her work after she made it, and it was only discovered after her death by her son Tony Penrose, when he found some dusty boxes in the attic full of her photographs from the war years. Women are less adequately represented in collections and archives, and of course this has a knock-on effect in terms of the writing of photographic history, because historians can only write about what they have access to. And this is a vicious circle, because fewer women are included in photo histories. Histories validate what is collected by museums or what's considered to be important. And just before coming here, I was looking at this new book that's come out by Anne Tucker, which is a really huge survey of war and photography, published in 2012. And it's a really comprehensive look at photography in conflict. Only 40 images are credited to women and 320 credited to men. And the second question I usually get asked when I tell people I'm working in war and photography, which you were asking me just now, is do men and women take different kinds of pictures? Do women have a different viewpoint? And I've thought about this a lot over the last few years whilst I've been working my PhD, and I think the answer is no. Women do not make different pictures from men in any intrinsic sense. To cite the photojournalist Jill Friedman, photographs are either good, bad or mediocre, but you can't tell the sex of the photographer by the photograph, and I believe that's true. I think despite assumptions that women are more intuitive or compassionate or emotional, I actually haven't seen any evidence to bear that out in photography. However, I do think women have been historically, and still are, subject to different limitations, different constraints, conventions and opportunities than those affecting men. And this is what shapes the way in which they make pictures and the way in which their photographs are read. And these opportunities are quite interesting, I think. So in my exhibition, I'm talking to a woman called Alison Baskerville, who was a former servicewoman. She was serving in the army in Afghanistan. She's now become a photographer. And she's making work about female soldiers in Afghanistan and how they're deployed as so-called peace builders, working with local Afghan women. And of course, this is something that would be off limits to male soldiers and to male photographers. So she's got kind of a different kind of permission and access because of her status as a woman. I'd say in conclusion that I don't think we should be tokenistic about representing female photographers, and I don't think or I'd be as suspicious of a group exhibition that brought women together purely on the basis of gender. But I do think when there's a clear rationale for shows of women's work, when there's a strong concept, then I think it's not only valid, but I think it's really important that we should do that. We live in the legacy of society where men and women have had or have been expected to behave differently and have had different levels of access, of education, of independence, and to some respects we still do. Women photographers are still underrepresented, under-exhibited, under-collected, understudied and underpaid, and I think we need to account for that in our curating.
Thank you very much for that. That's brilliant. I think maybe we can, if there's any immediate questions, we can ask them now, but I think maybe if we save those for the second part, I don't know what you guys want to say. Yeah, yeah. So any questions that you have, if you keep hold of those a little bit later on. But yeah, I don't know, next is it Jill that's going to speak next? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks Ollie, and that was a really interesting talk, thank you. So as Ollie said, I'm currently director of Pavilion. Pavilion is a visual arts commissioning organisation based here in Leeds. We're committed to producing research-led commissions with artists in diverse sites across the city, and I'm sure lots of you have seen some of our projects recently. So although Pavilion has historically worked with great deal with photographers. We're now very interested in a broad range of contemporary art practices. We've recently been working a lot with film and also installation. And so I don't want to claim any expertise at all in photography, and especially not street photography or photojournalism, but I hope this is still going to be a useful contribution in some way. When I was invited to speak, I kind of assumed that the discussion was aimed to be around the relationship of photography to feminism, to the feminist project. So I'm not quite sure now if that is the case. It might be that the organisers hoped more that we would have a discussion about the differences between male and female artists and photographers, in which case I wanted to kind of say that I'm not here with the belief that we can make any clear, definable distinctions between artists based simply on them being male or female, I guess, as Pippa was saying. But what I do think is that gender is and continues to be an axis of power, and that there remains a privileging of masculinity. And as such, it is very interesting to come together to consider what strategies we use as producers and administrators of art to intervene in dominant patriarchy in this kind of global capitalist context. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about Pavillion's history as part of the discussion, which I think is relevant. Pavilion was founded by Dinah Clark, Shirley Moreno and Caroline Taylor, who are 3 graduates of Leeds University's Fine Art course, who came together via the Leeds Women's Art Programme, an initiative based at the Swarthmore Adult Education Centre, which was kind of inspired by the feminist art programme in California and sought to coordinate and initiate women's art activity in Leeds. In 1981, out of this programme, the Leeds Women's Photography Project was formally launched, and in 1983, a derelict park pavilion opened as the UK's first dedicated photography space for women. I'm not sure how many of you visited the pavilion when it was there.
When I was at school.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. I didn't. I wasn't born there. Not the 60s.
Take that out of the recording.
Pavilion's practice was underpinned by an interest in feminist theory, by new emerging art practices, and a commitment to a programme of collectively produced projects made by, put by and for women, not only for women. There's some debate as to whether Pavilion was a separatist space. I think that depends on the time and who you ask. But it definitely had a commitment to new democratic structures, art practices and radical social change, and operated really as a kind of alternative space in Leeds, producing exhibitions, events and pedagogic activity. So photography was of central concern to Pavilion and the artists with whom it worked, artists such as Andrew Fisher, Tina Keane, Rosie Martin, Ingrid Pollard, Jo Spence. And this was really in large part due to the proliferation of media images that naturalised the objectification of women. Its exhibitions focused on themes of work, health, domesticity, race and class, and sought to illuminate the constructed ideological framework of images, the specific biases within art history and discourse, and the social and economic relationships of female oppression. The Pavilion programme and the theories of photography that correlated with it, such as John Tighe's The Burden of Representation, sought to challenge the idea that photography was a record of reality, and instead proposed that mainstream photographic images constructed a male-dominated worldview. Through new work, women artists challenged accepted notions of the artistic and evidential status of photography. For example, Jo Spence's project, Beyond the Family Album, which was shown at Pavilion, sought to reveal through photography her own bourgeoisification and the struggles through which she had been constructed as a woman and how she'd been represented by others. I thought I'd just read a little quote from Jo Spence. As a photographer, I spent most of my working life trying to visually represent other people. As a studio assistant carrying out my professional practice, I interpreted instructions from clients or employers. As a local newspaper photographer, I did as I was told, and took pictures which the editor would approve of. As a portrait photographer, I gave people a view of themselves that they wanted to see. When I reached 40, working as a freelance documentary photographer and becoming more politicised, I began to have serious doubts as to my right to continue with my work, to act on behalf of those I photographed who had no control of what I did with the images, or who could not decide what words would be put with their image. As a result of these doubts, I eventually gave up being a photographer. What was key to the sorts of exhibitions Pavilion and other spaces like it, and there was a really kind of strong network of kind of spaces that were showing women's photography in the 80s especially, was a kind of turning on its head of the norms of photography. So collectivity was explored over singular authorship, and process was focused on as much or even more than a final object. The Hackney Flashers, who I'm sure you know, a photography collective who also showed Pavilion, used photo montage combined with cartoons in their project Women and Work, which sought to reveal the lack of childcare provision. And according to the group, they couldn't simply use documentary photography alone because they said the strength of photography is to reveal what is there. They were interested in what was absent. In the 80s, when Pavilion was established, I think it's fair to say that photography was still a kind of marginalised art form. Certainly the Arts Council recognised a certain type of fine art or graphic art photography, but kind of felt required to produce new categorisations for the type of more politically engaged photography that artists were beginning to produce. And I think they started to call this like third category photography or something like that. Photography was seen by the founders of Pavilion and others as a very democratic medium, and much of Pavilion's work focused on workshops, on giving women in local communities cameras as a means of them taking control of the images that were made of them. In 1986 there was a project called That's Action Women, in which a set of tenants from local authority housing estates worked in collaboration with a photographer to produce a project comprising of text and photo montage that aimed to raise questions around issues of privatisation, poverty and homelessness. And this project was lent to other tenant groups to use in their own struggles, but it also actually toured Impressions Gallery when it was in York. And so it's kind of interesting the way a lot of this work straddled both kind of art and had these kind of wider and social and political applications. Spaces like Pavilion gave way for new forms of photography as well as artists who were challenging their own exclusion from institutions. An important exhibition we showed was called Testimony, 3 black women artists, with photographic work by Brenda Agar, Maud Salter and Ingrid Pollard, which opened up a space of discourse around the collective invisibility of black women in the art world. Writing about this show in her publication, The Thin Black Line, Labaina Himid notes, women artists were not being recognised as having a place in the visual arts generally, and even the feminist art movement has not given us enough room to manoeuvre within the discussions they were having in the art school and around the kitchen table. Black women artists were not getting the grants they deserved because they did not know the right avenues to follow. I was hungry to share with other black women to see whether there was a conversation to be had amongst ourselves around showing space, political place and visual art histories, how to develop ideas around making, visual representation, belonging and identity, what were the global realities of black sisterhood. So this gives some indication about the multiple exclusions being challenged through spaces like Pavilion. So we've been exploring our history a bit in this year in relation to a new commission we're producing to celebrate our 30-year history, which was last year. And through this we've been chatting a lot to the women and also men involved in Pavilion's founding years and reflecting on our own position in relation to this history as a team of younger producers. And it's been really interesting to talk to older feminists through this project. I think at times it's easy for people who are not there in the 70s and 80s to feel like we're maybe the anti-heroines of feminism, the people who have let it slip or perhaps retreated into academia is often an argument that's made. Others would argue that feminism has achieved its end and so is no longer relevant. And on recommendation, I've been recently reading a book called Why Stories Matter, The Political Grammar of Feminist Theory, which is really interesting for any of us who have a kind of stake in feminist discourse today. The book pays attention to how we might challenge the kind of limiting linearities produced when we rehearse feminist narratives. And Hemming suggests that the narratives told about feminism tend to be narratives of loss and progress or return, which maybe kind of unhelpfully confine feminisms to certain decades. So she suggests that lost narratives tell us that there was this kind of high moment of feminism in the 1970s, kind of radical feminism, when people were reclaiming the night, setting up important groups, kind of women against violence, really kind of actively challenging political structures. There was a famous incident of stink bombing in Leeds, when there was the Dress to Kill film at one of the cinemas. Progress narratives are the other side of the coin, and they tell us oh, look how we've moved on from the naive position of the 70s. Typically the idea is that in the 1980s, identity politics taught us that there are multiple sites of oppression. There's not just one type of woman, the white, middle class, heterosexual woman, but that there were working class women and lesbian women and black women who all had their own individual struggles. In the 90s, queer theory and post-colonial theory, people sort of say, moved us on further. And then there are the return narratives, the idea that we maybe lost our way through post-structuralism, but now we need to return to the material conditions of feminist experience. And we can probably all relate to these narratives, and it also interestingly kind of points out lots of journal articles kind of recently and historically where these kinds of narratives are perpetuated. Hemmings notes that the problem with these accounts of feminism is that they suggest a singular story without taking into account the multiple effects that feminism has produced. And she really is aiming to suggest how these different effects, so one subject's horror might be another's pleasure, she sort of says, and she talks very interestingly in relation to subjects such as transsexual surgery, female genital circumcision, veiling of Muslim women, reveal the way in which feminist narratives are constructed and enables a feminist discourse that allows for unpredictability and that sees feminism as a as yet unrealised project. So what is this unrealised feminist project? I just wanted to end by quoting Griselda Pollock from the Virtual Feminist Museum, who says that it is not simply about adding a few women to our half-empty museums, necessary as that remains tactically. It is a critical interrogation of the system some call patriarchy and others phallocentrism. As such, feminist itself marks the virtual as a perpetual becoming of what is not yet actual. It is a poiesis of the future, not a simple programme of corrective demands. So I thought I'd leave that there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. So next to speak is Helen. Yeah. Who you may have seen on Tuesday speaking before the Living Live film, but she's kindly given her time again today. So let's go.
Thank you, Ollie. I'm a lecturer on the BA Photography at Leeds College of Art, but my specialism is in history and theory of photography. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit just to kind of put that idea of the female gaze into context by starting off just by very briefly going over some ideas about gaze theory. So essentially, I suppose the gaze theory starts with Laura Mulvey, who's a feminist academic and writer, and she writes this really important essay, Visual Pleasures and Narrative Cinema, in 1975, and she uses for this essay, she bases the essay using sort of Freud's theories, but she applies them politically in an analysis of Hollywood film. So basically what she's doing is looking at the way that Hollywood film is shot and the way that it kind of fragments the female body. And this is really a kind of important idea for photography as well, also because of the action of the camera does a very similar thing. And I'm just quoting from the essay here, where she says, pleasure in looking has been split between the active male and the passive female. So her essay argues that when you're in the cinema you identify with the main character, the protagonist, who is usually male in the examples that she looks at, and that the male's gaze is projected onto the female characters as subjects of his gaze. So women in the film become objects to be looked at rather than having an active role in the narrative or in the story. So obviously lots of people since she's written this essay have taken her ideas and applied it to lots of different films to argue, for or against her ideas. But that's where the theories of the gaze are coming from. So woman is presented in her in her theory as as an image or as a spectacle, rather than the person who is the bearer of the look, who you might apply that phrase to a female photographer. So a good example of where you can see the male gaze at work is in the photography of Cindy Sherman. What she does is she employs visual cliches from film and from photography in her work, and she reenacts these visual cliches. So she's photographing, appealing to a kind of language that we all recognise, that we've sort of taken in from film, from advertising, etc. But she kind of remakes them with a sort of reference to those narratives. But in us knowing that she's a female photographer doing this consciously, that sort of slightly changes the narrative and slightly changes the angle, although she's almost replicating the male gaze in a lot of her images. And then the gaze theory has been taken on by people like John Berger, who applies the ideas to painting. So he looks at European oil painting, and he looks at the way particularly that the nude is presented in painting, and the way that the body is displayed for the viewer, who's inevitably assumed to be male again. And he looks at the way that the very sort of subtle ways that women might be appearing to allowing the viewer to look at them, to gaze on them uninterrupted. So techniques that he points out are often in an oil painting, the woman will be looking away. Therefore, we can look at her. She isn't actually looking back. There's no return of the gaze. Sometimes there are devices like a mirror employed in a painting, and it happens in photography as well. So that the mirror is a kind of device that distracts you from thinking. So if the woman is looking at herself in a mirror, that distracts you from thinking that you're imposing your look on her. You feel free to look at her because she's looking at herself. So there's this kind of a sort of implicit agreement that it's okay to look because she herself is regarding herself. So you're almost catching her in a moment where she's unaware because she's self-absorbed, absorbed in her own image. So there's lots of interesting applications of that theory. And then there's another essay which I won't go into now, but it's written by Rosalind Coward called The Look, which applies those theories specifically to photography. That's a really interesting essay also. So then people are obviously, I suppose, since the 1970s, sort of going into kind of postmodernism, people have been thinking about what might a female gaze be, and obviously I'm still thinking about that myself. And it's not just as simple as kind of turning the tables and objectifying men. That wouldn't solve the issue at all. Subjecting men to the same level of scrutiny or the same techniques of visual scrutiny wouldn't really achieve anything in that sense. I don't think it wouldn't be furthering women's practice as visual artists or photographers or filmmakers. So it's more than that. I think for me, I've been thinking about that kind of investigation of is there a particular way that women might look, and I suppose in the examples that Pippa gave, where women are working as photographers, that might be slightly different to an arena of photography where people are practicing as artists or are fine art photographers maybe, who are more likely, I suppose, to be reflecting perhaps on theory, responding to, making work that responds to theory, or perhaps even to historical works, so remaking historical works, which is sort of typical of postmodernism. So I think maybe in those works, that might be where we're getting towards what might be a female gaze, where people are sort of actively responding to or recreating these ideas about the female gaze. So I'm thinking about how the camera sort of freezes the look, maybe freezes the female gaze so that you can kind of examine it more easily, so that in a still image rather than in a film, the image is there, isn't it? The way that the woman has chosen to photograph is kind of open to maybe a more detailed examination. I suppose that's what I'm interested in doing. And I was thinking about Jane Bown's work, and I wrote a little blog post for Ollie's blog about the Looking for Light film. And I was thinking that maybe a characteristic of the female gaze in photography was to project yourself into the image somehow. So I was thinking about Jane Bown's work and the things that people were saying about her, and the things that she said about her own practice, which were other people also confirmed, which was that, you know, she stuck fairly rigidly to the same aperture and shutter speed, and she always used natural light. And so those are her characteristics, and they are very strong, very recognisable in the images, but they don't cancel out the sitter. You know, the negotiation between the sitter and the photographer is, although I wouldn't say it was 50-50, and Sean O'Hagan in the film also says that he thinks the same, that actually she is quite, Jane Bown was, the way she works was quite manipulative, in the sense that maybe actually if you wanted to put a figure on it, it might be more like 60-40, in the sense that she imposed her gaze onto the sitters, but at the same time they all said that they felt that what they were looking at were very intimate images of themselves. So it wasn't the case that she imposed herself to a level where they were obscured. And I was thinking about whether that might be a female way of working, and for you to appear in the images in some way, and to literally kind of put yourself in the picture, to use Jo Spence's again. One of her books was about this idea of using photography as a therapy, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So I want to talk about Jocelyn Allen's work also. So I was thinking about appearing in the work, in particular relation to Vivienne Mayer's self-portraits, which I think is fascinating, that you get that sense almost of her kind of looking for herself, and this is really interesting in relation to this sort of, whether that's a myth of her as the kind of invisible woman, you know, that she, in lots of ways, in a kind of social or professional setting, she was very much in the shadows, and you know, she lived in people's houses, but she wasn't a kind of, she wasn't invisible, but she was kind of in the background, I suppose, in their lives. But yet, in the self-portrait, she's very much present, and there's this experience maybe of photographing yourself to see how you look photographed, as a way of maybe sort of reflecting on yourself. And I was thinking, you know, that's similar to people like Claude Cahun, and especially in that sort of, some of Vivienne Mayer's portraits I felt there were really strong references to surrealism, again with the kind of use of mirrors and that way of reflecting yourself back using that technique. So then I was also thinking about selfies, because, you know, they are selfies, aren't they? Those images of her, and this kind of contemporary obsession that we have with selfies at the moment. And a lot of the discussion about selfies is based around young women, isn't it? To what level, or in what manner they depict themselves. You know, whether that's sexual or non-sexual, whether they're wearing makeup or not wearing makeup. So I think there's just something about that is something about that photographing oneself that holds kind of a key maybe to a kind of female way of looking. So then that sort of led me to think about Jocelyn Allen's work, which is in Village. It's a portrait of her. Has she got her hair over her face? You can't see her face, can you?
Yeah.
So it's only a single image. So I don't think you get a sense of what the work's about, unfortunately, just in that single image. Was it from Your Mind and Body is all that you've got?
Yeah, I think that. Am I right saying there's the books up there as well?
Okay, you've got the book in the shop. So that's a single image from a work that is a series of images where she photographed herself in a studio setting, which again is, I think, a very strong reference to Jo Spence's work, in that she's in this kind of studio setting, just a simple sort of stool and a white background, and she's kind of using a form of phototherapy, photographing herself, and she puts these self-portraits alongside extracts from her teenage diary, which I think is really interesting, and particularly because I'm interested in the working of text and image together, so I'm interested in photographers like Sophie Calle and Mary Kelly, and that use of a kind of diaristic text with photography in particular, and Jocelyn Allen uses that. So in the diary extract, she's talking about how other people perceive her, as I'm sure, you know, lots of us do when you're a teenager. You know, you get to that age where you're kind of self-conscious and other people are commenting on your appearance. So her diary entries are her reflections on other people's responses to the way she looks. So again, things about her body, her figure, her hair, her makeup. And they're all very much critical, self-critical. They're reflections of criticisms from outside of her, but they're also very self-critical. So I just thought that's a really interesting piece of work that I think, again, might be a very feminine way of working, but maybe some people can give me examples of male work that's similar to that, and you know. So yeah, I was just starting to think about that very important age in adolescence. Well, where you become an adolescent, when you become an adolescent, when you realise you're becoming a woman, is when other people start commenting on your appearance. Perhaps that doesn't happen when you necessarily to the same level when you're a child. So you're almost a woman when these kind of criticisms start perhaps hitting you, or you become aware of them and start reflecting on them, I suppose. I've kind of stopped there. I thought I had more, but I don't know anyway. So yeah, that's it.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Zoe Zoya. I'm curator at the Tetley, what was PSL. So we are a contemporary art centre. We were based in Whitehall Waterfront. We're now based in the Old Tetley Brewery, and we work with early career to mid-career artists to develop new commissions, often site-specifically using the galleries as extended studio spaces. So I'll begin by saying that I'm neither photography or the female gaze or women artists are my specialist research area, and I'll also say that this presentation will probably be a lot shorter and it's definitely less academically rigorous than the ones that I'm following. So anyway, but as a curatorial practitioner within the field of contemporary art, I want to offer some considerations around the programming of women artists. I'll touch on the merits of gender-biased or selective curation and raise a few points about the current state of equality in contemporary art programming and the art market in terms of exposure and critical acclaim. I also want to mention a couple of projects that I think relate to today's discussion, maybe a bit tangentially, but they might prompt a bit of discussion in the second half of the session. Okay, right. So, though it was pretty sobering, I don't think anyone was surprised by the statistics which the Fawcett Society study into the London art scene of 2011 revealed. 78% of galleries in London represent more men than women. Only 17% of galleries represent more women than men. And only 5% represent an equal number of male and female artists. Helen shared a couple of statistics with me earlier also. Just one in which relate more to this discussion maybe. Just 1 in 4 of the nominees for the Deutsche Boyser Prize, photography prize over the past 8 years have been women. The auction houses Sotheby's and Christie's attribute the highest sale of a living female artist's work to Katie Noland at $6.6 million, and the highest sale of a living male artist's work to Jeff Koons at $58 million. So you can see a divide still exists. The facts and figures just highlight that there is that unequal divide between the professional success of male and female artists. No art organisation can ignore the historical imbalances between men and women within contemporary art, but some curators who are more concerned with consciously addressing it in their programming, some curators are more concerned with consciously addressing it within their programming. Equally, many are eager to address the unequal representations of other marginalised groups. The art market has been male-dominated and Eurocentric for a long time, and the art history canon remains incomplete. Every curator wants to acknowledge these issues and has a different approach to addressing the balance. The last 10 years has seen a wealth of retrospectives and selective survey shows documenting these marginalised artists and re-entering them into the canon. At the Tetley and PSL, our approach has been a light touch approach. We pay close attention to the mix of artists we work with, and we make a concerted effort to show an intergenerational mix of artists, so putting early career artists alongside mid-career artists, so artists that are fresh out of college, new graduates, alongside artists that might have a 20-30 year career, but sometimes they're equally emerging or established. We also try to monitor the balance of the artists we show in terms of race and sexuality and nationality in the same way that Pippa mentioned. But looking back at the artists we've worked with closely since 2006, there are still imbalances. Maybe 40% of the artists we've worked with are female, 60% male, 60% are under 30, and just 15% over 50, just 11% are non-white. We have had all female and all male shows, but it's the content and the material qualities of the work rather than the artist's gender which is being foregrounded. Sometimes it's difficult to be wholly representative without employing quite stringent quotas. Projects such as Her Noise, a Sound Up project which began in 2001 and culminated in a large-scale touring exhibition in 2006 to 8, go some way to demonstrate the validity of pro-actor gender-biased curation. The curators, Lena Juz, I can't pronounce her name, Javerovich, I think, and Anne-Hilda Nesset, explained that the project came about as a reaction to the realisation that they had unwittingly been excluding women practitioners from the cross-media events that they'd been programming for 4 years at Lux Art Centre in London in the late 90s. They stated that they realised that only one woman artist had been invited to take part in 3 dozen out of 3 dozen sound artists, authors, musicians and filmmakers. They asked why that was the case. They challenged themselves. Were there too few women artists around making experimental music and sound art, or had they become biased against the women after working for so long with men, alongside men? They were inspired by strong female performers while they were growing up, but somehow their world had become almost entirely populated by male practitioners. The archive still exists at the University of the Arts in London, and I think it's a great resource, and maybe it stands as an example of how a gender kind of selective show, such as this one, can act as an archive for artists that are operating at the moment, and just for the general public. They credit the archive as reflecting the heterogeneous way that women artists work, and it acts as a mapping tool to make an inroad into the experimental sound art and performance work that's being made by artists, how densely populated that scene actually is by female artists. The goal for curators is perhaps to be gender neutral and to show an equal ratio of great work from every culture and every subculture, but to ensure that's possible, I actually believe that proactive programming, whether it's an ongoing curatorial method or a sporadic one, definitely plays a vital role. What would the UK's art programming have looked like, and what would the list of artists that are known to all of us in the room today be without the activism of organisations like Pavilion, the Black Art Group, Make Women's Art Library, Cinenova, Innova, and Bird's Eye View Festival, to name a few. So what are the strategies that we could all employ to address the balance? We could have percentage targets for representations in shows. We could make specific projects which consider these issues. We can have educational programmes and events such as this one. We can make retrospectives of overlooked female artists and try and reintegrate them into the canon of art. And we can also encourage the sales and collection of female artists and other marginalised artists, and we can support the development, the professional development of those artists also. Jennifer Chan, in her essay, Why Are There No Great Women Net Artists, states that the existing models of curating valorise effeminate forms of expression that may validate old stereotypes and spectacle. While she doesn't think this is problematic, and that the feminist art canon may embrace this, it can't be all that is programmed formulaically. She says that on a macro level, these positions deter the actual feminist goal of achieving equal representation in exhibition spaces. To increase female presence in exhibition female presence in exhibition spaces, arts administrators need to look beyond the femaleness or feminism in artwork to consider its form and content in relation to the concept during the evaluation of whether or not it's grey art. She believes that the onus is on emerging curators and artists as curators to apply an extra effort to research and include a diverse range and perspective of her particular research area, digital art and internet art. This means to consciously programme and include women, whether or not they make work that fits into the existing aesthetic and sensibilities of what net art should look like and maybe what women's art should look like. Working within a limited budget, as many of us do, it's sometimes difficult to work with a truly diverse, internationally representative mix of artists, but I think this show at Village demonstrates how the internet can be used as a tool to foster links across the globe, and also illustrates that some mediums, for example, digital technologies, audio, photographic work, lend themselves to being shown anywhere in the world. They're quite easily disseminated and reproduced anywhere. The projects we've worked on, or I've worked on in Mexico, have also made use of the internet as a tool to disseminate work from Leeds and bring work from outside of the UK to Leeds. I'm going to sum up now. I guess maybe there is a step change. The fact that the last 2 years Turner Prize winners have been women, one of which was heavily pregnant while she was nominated for the prize, is definitely a positive thing. And I think the fact that women like Laure Prouvost are continuing their careers whilst maintaining their family commitments, raising families, and also women continue to work throughout their life, may do something to redress that balance. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Cool. So yeah, thank you to all of you for that. That was all really interesting. I think we'll probably just crack on with maybe if anyone has any immediate questions. I know some of you submitted questions before, which I've got at the back somewhere, which I can read out. But yeah, if you did do that, feel free to kind of ask them yourself if you want to. But based on what we've been speaking about, what speakers here have spoken about, has anyone got anything they'd like to ask? Anyone here? I don't know. Anyone wants to have any thoughts? Do we have any microphones or anything? Who's going to go first? No one's going. Oh, yeah, go for it, yeah.
Got a bit of a question. So obviously you've got an all-female panel, mainly all-female audience. But how important do you think that, or does the panel think that it is only women who should sort of take on the mantle of promoting female artists or promoting female photographers within photography kind of sphere? Or how important is it also that men take on this agenda? And I'm not sort of speaking in a tokenistic way. It's like, oh no, look, put on a female-only exhibition as Villages run by 2 men, and Hyde Park Beach House, from what I can gather, is mainly male-run. Is this true?
No.
Is this true? That's fine, I'll take that back. Just from like my experience, it's fine. But certainly Villages is run by 2 men, but where's that? Where is the kind of collaboration between men and women and taking out that gender divide, so it's taken forward as a collaboration, as a gendered collaboration, rather than we'll put forward women just to redress a balance. And you've all stated that that showing women and showing the art and showing sort of good quality art is much more important than putting forward a feminist agenda or putting forward a sort of all-female agenda.
Yeah. I think we've all got a responsibility to show good art, but then we've also all got a responsibility, whatever sex you are working in the arts, to show a diverse kind of demographic of artists as well.
I think it's interesting to look back at, when we do look back at feminist histories as well as feminist presence, to think about it not being about gender, just about representing women or representing men. I mean, first of all, there's the fact that women and men are not kind of fixed identities in themselves, which is, so I think we kind of need to acknowledge that. But in terms of, I was kind of thinking about how feminism provides a challenge to capitalism today, and to how that our responsibility as curators to kind of learn from the feminist histories, that we're thinking about alternative structures to individualism and competition, and we're thinking about collectivity, and we're thinking about sharing and support. And when we're sort of working in a context, a cultural context where there's precarious work and there's poorly paid workers and there's non-unionisation, it's interesting for us all to think about how we take responsibility to kind of address those things, which might not necessarily be seen as a kind of gender issue, but I think in terms of what we can learn from feminism, that is so important, and that's something for us all to kind of think about. So I'm sure that doesn't answer your question, but
thinking about the fact that we are all women as a panel and the audience, I think that you do have to be really proactive to make things more inclusive, because quite often, especially when you're operating on a more DIY level, maybe you often work with your automatic peers, your immediate peers, and sometimes your social set it's not as diverse as maybe you'd hope it to be as well. So I don't know how we could have potentially drummed up more interest from the men in things. I don't know what didn't appeal to them. It doesn't matter that they're not here, in lots of ways, but it's kind of interesting that they're not represented equally.
Well,
I know
there's a few of us. At our age, we could pay very low clothes on years of experience.
Well, I certainly don't think it's a women-only project to promote women photographers. It should be an equal project, definitely. I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't be. And it is interesting because I was thinking how there are so many women actually in positions of power in a way in the art world, in terms of there are a lot of women working for galleries, Women Impressions. It happens to be a female-only organisation. That's just the way it is. That's not a deliberate choice. I noticed that I think Sotheby's has become an all-woman team lately. There are more female picture editors. So there are women in these positions where they have the power to select more women photographers. So I still don't know why there's this imbalance. I suppose I'm thinking historically I can see lots of reasons, and in terms of today I'm not.
I just think that you've doing yourself doing us all an injustice. I'm not picking on anyone in particular by using words like imbalance. It just seems to me that the statistics can be used to prove anything, and quoting the amount paid to Jeff Koons doesn't do it for me. Actually, we've got, there's a really good example. We've got a gallery virtually run in state. It's one of the most important institutions. And then we've got Pavilion, which has had a really significant role. But when you talk about Pavilion, you were talking almost directly out of the 1980s. I was here, Leeds. I came to Leeds. I was very aware of all of that. And Pippa spoke really interestingly about war photography, and with a great deal of balance. Basically, all along, there've been women who've dismissed the whole issue of some kind of special or femininity being treated as some kind of disability, from Lee Miller through to Margaret Bourke-White, Jane Brown, Eva Arnold, specifically being challenged on this and said, God's sake, and have been quite eloquent. And this is where I think the terrible kind of injustice is done. There are whole areas where women have a tremendous advantage. If you're looking for, if I were looking at statistics, I'd look at statistics. I'm not trying to put a counter argument, of course. But if you're looking for funding arts funding today, it's got to have a community element. Well, you know, really, community element that didn't include women just wouldn't feature. If you want to go into people's homes, if there's an element of intimacy, you're going to have a much harder time as a bloke.
Yeah.
If you're going to be photographing children, you're going to be jumped on much more quickly as a bloke. There are areas that are really interesting. I've been going out on my own recently into just really close to the suburbs, taking nature photographs really within, and I know that I've spoken to a couple of women and they wouldn't do it on their own. They'd do it with me, but they wouldn't do it on their own. I've done a whole series, 2 years, photographing Saturday nights in Leeds. And even when I was looking for collaborators, I found it difficult to find a young bloke who would do it with me. And it would have been a different ballgame altogether with a woman. I don't think we've even begun to get at the issues. And it seems a pity. You know, it seems a great pity. A little correction there, because you asked about men. Laura Mulvey's book you quoted, 1975, John Berger's Ways of Seeing was 1972, begins with an acknowledgement of his debt to the woman.
Oh, right.
And the part, that the particular film about the nude, and he then discusses with a panel of them. I think that discussion is very kind of interesting. But it seems to me that there's a real that we haven't really begun to. At that point, you know, I expected great things. I was looking for something special that might have been under this heading, the female gaze. Is there something different? And it seemed to me that there's another terrible kind of trap we can fall into. It's just to assume that there's some kind of biological destiny, that there's a female gaze and a male.
I think we were all saying that
it might
it's
be
not.
socially informed rather than
No, but honestly,
biologically informed.
it's a really interesting question. You know, it's a really interesting question. But it you know, it doesn't.
Do you want a chance to respond to that? Any of that at all?
I don't think we were arguing there was something biologically involved. I certainly
No,
wasn't
absolutely
arguing
not.
that. There's someone dying to jump in just behind you.
I was just going to say actually before talking of imbalance, I was in a photography exhibition last year, and I found out on the private view night I was the only woman, and out of 14 photographers, it was me and 14 men in this one group exhibition, which was quite shocking.
And who were the selectors for that?
Well, it was a woman who selected it, which is interesting, but the point I was going to make was it actually came on to my favour, because during the night when people realised I was the only woman, I kind of got all the attention, kind of by default in a way. But I was just going to make the point about imbalance, like one woman, 14 men in one show, that's not balanced. That was only last year. And that was a woman who curated that. But as I say, it came good in the end, because I was the only woman, I kind of got attention because of that.
I'm just thinking about the way decisions are made, also when we're talking about sort of curating and making those choices at an early stage. I'm thinking about Photobook Bristol, and I wasn't there myself this year, but I know somebody who was. And the discussion was basically that there weren't enough women represented this year, and so somebody who was on the panel just said, oh, all right, then we'll just do all women next year, and that's what they're doing, and that's a really important event for photography, Photobook Bristol. But the decision's almost kind of, you know, it's not. I mean, you could call that tokenism, couldn't you? You could say that was tokenistic. It was just a sort of random decision in a response to a criticism of this year's award. But who does it matter really? If there's an all-women event next year, I think that's good. If every woman in Photobook Bristol, every person next year is a woman.
A couple of you mentioned that that women tend to undervalue their own work. And I'm just interested to know why you think that is, panel.
I think I said it, yeah. And maybe it's not so true now, I don't know. I'm thinking historically, there have been, the conventions are that women shouldn't be pushy or aggressive.
Well, Vivian May is an example.
I think she might be different.
Not undervaluing it, but
the fact she
not feeling that it was important. Yeah, not feeling that it was important.
Say maybe, you know, the fact that there weren't so many submissions from women. It's not like they're not out there. Women photographers are out there.
They are out
but
there.
Maybe
yeah.
I think there is some validity in that sense of one's own value and one's own place in it all, and particularly the competition you tend to be up against. Not in terms of the quality of work, but just but just being up against loads of men who do hold positions of power and who do make decisions that are not always in the best interests of women. So I do think there's a lot of validity in what you were saying, Pippa, about women undervaluing their own work and how we can overcome that or bring it out in the open. You know, if you feel that you undervalue your work, if you know that you undervalue your work, how can we address that? How can we open that up and crack that open wide?
Yeah, I'd be really interested to see what happens in the future, because it's my understanding, maybe you can confirm this, Helen, is that there are more female photography students than male.
There definitely is at Leeds College of Art, yes.
I mean, I was trying to get some figures. Have got any figures?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it's way
above. Course that completed last year's BA course, there were, definitely, over all 3 years, far more women than male students. But also in the department, out of a department of 7 lecturers, there was 1 female.
Okay.
I thought there was an interesting imbalance in how there was just a lack of preparation in offering information to the female students. This is what they're up against when they qualify and they leave. You know, they're in an equal environment in education and a very unequal environment outside of education. And that doesn't seem to be addressed in an educational environment.
We have other people who think, right, I'm going to make t-shirts for a living. You know, I'm going to, you know what I mean? I just purely, and this is completely not backed up with any evidence whatsoever, but I know a lot of artists, and the men tend to exhibit, and the women tend to sort of go into craft-based businesses, as well as trying to make their work at the same time. But they sort of, whereas the men have jobs like they'll work in cafes or whatever to support their art, women will sort of use their art as being their main living. I suspect there probably is a difference in reasons why the women are underrepresented in art, and I wonder if it's maybe because, you know, the galleries, is it because there aren't enough people actually doing that? You said there are people who work, they've chosen to work in these careers where they're working at Sotheby's, and all of you have jobs where you're working within the art industry. But I wonder maybe if these women are choosing to work in different careers rather than actually producing it. I don't know, I just wondered if there's any evidence to back that up, or if there is any reason as to, not just from the World War period, but if there's any reason why women are not represented. Is it purely discrimination?
I think it's just like a historical fact that less women had any profession up until like kind of 40, 50 years ago, other than within the home, and they were working within the home, and like
now?
Yeah, and it's that's really changed just because it has, like in recent years, and I think the impact of that is probably still to be felt.
I think that's quite interesting what happens in the next 20 years when we have a lot of women in positions of selection and more female photographers coming through, and there have clearly been historical role models for women that more and more every generation, so there are women that can emulate women that have gone before them. That's happening in Magnum, for instance. I mean, Magnum Photo Agency is still 74 men, 9 women, so it's still a really small percentage, but there are more women starting to come through Magnum now. So I think it's perhaps identifying, it's kind of mentoring and role models as part of it, as well as the education, I think.
So you were going to say something?
Yes, I was wondering if anyone wants to speculate on what is it about photography that makes this an issue, like as a discipline or as a technology or as an art form. What is it about photography that makes it particularly hostile to women or particularly welcoming to women? I mean, what are the pros and cons?
I think there are particular issues, but I think in some ways it's kind of hospitable to women. it's quite interesting. I think it's a relatively new art form. You know, when it was invented in 1839, it didn't have the same connotations as, it doesn't have the whole weight of history of painting, which has been predominated by men. It's a new art form. We're not sure if it's a science or a craft or an art form. Women were involved right at the beginning of photography. As practitioners, as innovators, they had a hand in developing photographic technology. What's really interesting, I think, I was talking to Ollie when you came over to Impressions the other day, is that at the beginning of photography, women were seen as particularly suited to it. They were seen to have better manual dexterity and an eye for detail, more so than men. And I think something shifted maybe post-war, in that photography became about lenses and numbers and technical things which women can understand. And that's kind of, we have to historicise that. That wasn't the case at the beginning of the origins of photography.
Wasn't the box brownie marketed specifically at women?
That was. So there are these different historical periods when photography is seen as something which is particularly appropriate to women. So I wonder if that's why there are more. I mean, we're talking about an imbalance, but it's no way near the imbalance in, say, the history of painting. It's always relative, you know.
I think it is to do with representation though, so someone like Vivian Mayer, whether she recognised herself as an artist, she definitely wasn't a professional artist, and photography, most people have a camera, most people kind of test it out and they might be artists. I don't know who in this room has got like archives of photos that might be discovered and deemed art in the future at some point, you never know. I think the technologies of video art, so women really pioneered video art, but they're not the ones that went down in history as pioneering video art. I think, there's there's books, there's essays, there's lots of research out there that kind of demonstrates that there was like this equal role in nearly every art movement since the beginning of like art. Women have been more or less equally involved and kind of played a pivotal role. It's just their male partner or male counterpart has been better publicised or kind of gone down in the annals. I think
I was kind of suggesting in the thing that I said that I think what might appeal about photography is that self-reflection, that cameras are tool for self-reflection, and that's not to do with technology necessarily. That could be just selfies or whatever. But I think that for some reason that appeals.
We've got time for one more question if anyone.
There's a question.
I saw the film on Tuesday, and it really, and I really liked your comments at the end and the reaction that we got. And it made me think about just in terms of thinking about women valuing their work, and maybe if we assumed that she did value her work, and that was there any sort of active refusal in keeping it secret, or was sort of.
Did she actively? Is there any evidence that she actively hid it from people? Is that what you mean?
Or preferring it for some reason.
Sorry, preferring not to be visible and not to especially in contrast to the way the guy that discovered her has sort of turned her into this brand and has made her this successful artist. Is there anything in the way that she was a photographer that was that challenged, I don't know, any sort of structure or sort of like the politics of being made visible or becoming a subject in a particular way? That's why I'd like to have a look at the archive. I don't think you can tell through that edit, John Malouf's edit of her work. I don't think you can see her, and I suppose that's what I'd like to see, is to have more of a bigger quantity of work available to see if there was something in there that we can. I just feel there's not enough being drawn out at the moment, and that all those kind of questions like the ones that you're asking might be evidenced in the work. But at the moment we can't see that, so we haven't got that access.
So I was just going to say, Tuesday night the BBC kindly showed the
Yes,
Top Nanny
good
Spit.
timing, and it's still on iPlayer.
Well, I can say it's going to be on catch up, but
Yeah.
one of the points they make is that over her career, she moved from trying to display her work to actually privatising it.
Yes.
But they don't fully explain it. But
No.
it's clearly that it's partly to do with her own personal biography, but it's also to do with the operations of photography in the 50s and 60s.
And
It's in there, they talk about it.
in the who took Nanny's pictures, you're right, yeah. But I suppose she didn't have a network of any kind, did she? So even if she'd had some vague idea that she wanted people to see the work, you know, how would you go about that?
But you did
You know,
have
with no.
postcards made in Chester.
Yes, well, yeah.
There's one
John
there,
Maloof
and then
puts
it
that
sort of
forward as an
picked out,
example
yeah.
that she might have wanted to display the work.
It's kind of to validate that he's taken over her life.
Well, yeah.
It does raise a really interesting question there, because I came away thinking about, you know, we, with the best will in the world, we're really keen to kind of rediscover overlooked women practitioners and reinsert them into the canon. Something I've come across in my own work as well, because I've been doing some research about an American woman who made some photograph albums during the Mexican Revolution of the snapshots that she made of soldiers and her family. And they've been lying in an archive in Texas. I found them, I'm writing about them. She probably never wanted them to become public. So I've got a responsibility, do I make them public? Because I think it's validating women's work, but it's something that she didn't intend to do. So I think there are really interesting ethical questions about what we consider to be right for the, you know, I don't know that there's an answer to that, but it made me think.
Yeah, well, there's a move in photography, isn't there, at the minute for reappropriated photography, and you could say that about all reappropriated photography. You know, people like Eric Kessels who are finding family albums in flea markets and then representing it in a different way as his own work in a way. Although he's not claiming authorship, but he's reinterpreting it, and that argument could apply to that kind of work as well, couldn't it?
But equally on that, it depends on how far. I was doing some research on somebody, and like a lot of these archives, there was a lot of material put in there by another member of the family. And you suddenly felt, I feel a bit uncomfortable with this. So though they let the material go, did they let it go because we're clearing the property and selling it, which is what the case was? And it is a very fine balancing act between saying, well, perhaps they don't want that to be publicly known. And I actually went back to the archive and said, I really think you ought to contact, as I happen to know the other members of the family, really ought to go back to them, say, for another few years before you make a decision. It was just a little bit too close, you know, on that bit. And as I say, like with your comments about the thing in Mexico, people do take these things, and for reasons that you don't know why at the time, and in fact, quite a few well-known images of the American Dust Bowl, the woman just stops and disappears. And there's never been an answer to why. And there's other materials, and as I say, it's a very fine balancing act to do.
Cool. I think, if there's any other burning questions, anyone else got anything else to add? No?
I'd just like to ask about self-control, because in Vivian Mayer, she was sort of very, very cryptic about who she was. She presented herself as Enigma now. I read that as that if you lie about who you are, it's because you don't want other people to stereotype you in any way. She kept this sort of, you know, nobody could read her, but her self-portraits showed self-control. And I wonder, because she presented herself in this particular manner, she was very deliberate, this is how she wanted to see herself. And I wonder if maybe that would make people feel a little bit less guilty about sort of digging up her.
The fact that she was happy to be seen on camera, you think means that she was happy to be visible?
I just wondered if that was what, possibly that was one.
I haven't thought about that. Again, it's all kind of speculation, isn't it? Because we've no way of knowing what her hopes were for the work, or
maybe. But I'm just thinking about selfies. And I know that I certainly take pictures. I put them on my Facebook, and I'm very, very. It's because I want to.
It's about controlling your own image.
Yeah, but even for me, just for me, I want. You know, even if nobody else saw them, I'd say this represents who I am, and this certainly doesn't.
Better than anyone else can, I suppose.
I think so.
Yeah, I think that's an element. Well, I felt an element of that in her self-portraits. Yeah, that she, represented herself better than anyone else could, and yeah, in a sense, she didn't want other people to define her or put her in a box. Sort of, similar to what you're saying.
So an argument, I suppose, for your wanting to recover all the archives would be, they said it had it in the BBC documentary where one of the chaps said, you can almost see that this chronicles a day in her life, and if you put all of the strips together, you could just basically map out her entire life.
And that need to document, I think, is maybe what's stronger for her than any other, desire to show it. I think it was, because that, for me, fits in with that idea of collecting things as well. All the other things that she collected, for her maybe photographing was that, that need to document every single minute of her life in some way. Well, again, it's all speculation.
Also, there's just something in the fact that because of the technology which she was using at the time, all of her self-portraits, which I think should be the term selfie really, were in reflective surfaces because of what she was working with. So it was really, I think, as much it can be argued that it was as much to do with just purely the aesthetic of what she was trying to create, because it wasn't just about the reflective surfaces, but the compositional elements that were employed in a lot of those images were about texture and pattern.
Which is what made me think about surrealism.
Right, exactly. So, I don't know, there's just something about the fact that it's not just about her taking a picture of her, but it's about being a part of the materials, the actual physical materials, the reflective surfaces, and the aesthetic of the textures which she was observing.
And maybe existing visual traditions as well, because there is some of her work that's very derivative of other photographers, like Lee Friedlander. And so you can see that she looked at other work.
Diane Arbus in particular, off the time, you can definitely see that influence. And compositionally, all of them, all of you would seem incredibly strong, very, very strong.
And that's a way of learning about photography, isn't it? To sort of imitate or emulate other photographers.
I think we're out of time, actually. But yes, thank you very much to speakers for coming and giving your time. I think it's been interesting. Thank you all for coming as well. Just want to say a few thanks as well to Village, Joe from Village, for collaborating with Pitch House on this. Hopefully it will be one of many collaborations that we'll do together. And also to Sophie and Abby for curating the exhibition. It's, I think the shop is still, is it shut now? Is it locked? Yeah, it's finished. Okay, it's been on for another week. So it's, it's obviously a massive space up there, but I think it's been a brilliant addition to this programme. And also, thank you to Smee for designing the handout that we've ran out of because everyone took them all. So thank you so much for your time on that. And thanks for coming. Thanks a lot. Cheers.